Have you ever heard of the Holodomor? My guess is you haven't, although some people have, and certainly Ukrainians have. The Holodomor was a disaster in the Soviet Union that took place in 1932 to 1933, so 90 years ago. During this disaster, around 3 million Ukrainians died from starvation. In fact, the word Holodomor comes from death from starving, basically, starvation and death. Now, this was a man-made famine based on decisions that people made and the Soviet government made. Primarily, it was their emphasis on rapid industrialization that led to a collapse in agriculture, but also the use of their grain to trade for machinery and equipment they needed at the expense of the peasantry living in Ukraine. You could think also about Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward that killed 20 to 30 million Chinese by a misallocation of resources and a police state enforcing cruel rules. Now, one of the debates with the Holodomor in 1932 to 33 was whether these 3 million Ukrainians who died were killed on purpose or was it just incompetence? There's no argument about whether it was a tragedy. It was clearly a tragedy. It was clearly mass death caused by human actions or inactions. But was it a genocide? That's being debated even today. Now, the term genocide has two roots, actually one Greek and one Latin for those who are interested in languages. The word for group, think of genus or genes, right? And killing, side, like homicide, regicide. A genocide is the killing of a group of people. The term genocide was coined in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish-Jewish lawyer who had been thinking about the issue vis-a-vis the Armenian mass murder under the late Ottoman Empire since at least 1921. Upon the death of one of the architects of that mass murder, he said, why couldn't he be charged with a crime? It was a crime without a name at the time. Now, Lemkin himself, during the Holocaust, escaped. He managed to escape Poland in 1939, getting to Sweden, and then ultimately to the United States, where he served as a law professor at Duke University. Lemkin lost 49 members of his family. In fact, everyone except for his brother and his brother's wife and two kids who managed to survive in a Soviet labor camp of all places. But Lemkin is the one who coined the term genocide and ultimately was sort of the father of the concept of this international crime by his definition. So I want to share with you Lemkin's definition of what a genocide is. So here's how Lemkin described it. Genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aimed at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. So it's not only mass killings, it's even more. The objectives of such a plan would be the disintegration of the political and social institutions, of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of the personal security, liberty, health, dignity, even the lives of individuals belonging to such groups. Genocide is directed against the national group as an entity, and the actions involved are directed against individuals, not in their individual capacity, but as members of the national group. So notice, it's not just killing lots of people in a group, or even trying to kill the whole group. It's trying to wipe out that group and its culture and its identity. So that means it's not only killing, it's also attacking their culture, their language, their religion, their economic subsistence, and individually attacking not only the life, but even the health, the dignity, the liberty of the individuals that are part of that group. Now, if you compare this to what happened during the Holocaust, it's very obvious the Holocaust did all of these things because the Nazis not only killed Jews, but they took away their dignity by putting numbers on their arms instead of names in concentration camps. They undermined their sense of culture by banning education, by burning Torah scrolls, by destroying Jewish cultural institutions. They attacked their health by putting them in unsanitary ghettos, by feeding them starvation food levels, calorie levels, and so on. And of course, killing them in great numbers, which is the primary definition of a genocide. But you can see that the Nazi program was not simply a killing of the Jews, it was the killing of Judaism. In fact, the Nazis had the idea that they would have to make a museum of Jewish identity and culture because they would be so thorough in wiping out Judaism and the Jews, nobody would know what it was. And so they had to preserve some of the items that were the relics of this extinct culture that they would have caused to go extinct. Now, there are many examples of things called a genocide, or that have been called a genocide in the 20th and 21st centuries. There are famous ones like the case that motivated Lemkin, the Armenians during World War I, which resulted in almost 1 million dead. There were, of course, the case of the Jews during World War II, and also the Romani people, sometimes called gypsies inappropriately, during World War II. You have the Cambodian killing fields of the 1970s. It killed up to 2 million people, 1/4 of the population of the country. You have mass killings by Serbians of Bosnian Muslims, not only killing them, but intentionally raping the women to cause pregnancy and expelling them from their territories. That took place in the 1990s, killed over 30,000 and displaced over 1 million. In Rwanda, Hutus killed over 500,000 Tutsis and raped up to 500,000 more with a similar agenda. In the 21st century, just in the last 24 years, the people of the Darfur region in Sudan had 200,000 killed from 2003 to 2005. The Yazidis in northern Iraq were attacked by the Islamic State with, again, a program of murder, forced rape, and forced conversion to wipe out their identity and culture. And the Rohingya in Myanmar in the last decade. When you hear this litany of mass killing, attacking culture, destroying people, you begin to wonder, is the truth of the slogan "never again" simply again and again and again? Because it keeps happening. Now, there is actually an evolutionary basis to this. It's very unusual in the animal kingdom to see this kind of mass wipeout of one's own species, but it does happen in our closest relatives, in chimpanzees. There have been cases where we've seen chimpanzee bands attack another band and wipe them all out, not simply drive them out of a territory, but kill them all. So we come by it honestly, I guess, genetically, but between us and the chimpanzees, we're the only ones that are willing to do this, to kill our own species to such a great number because of ideology, because of identity. It's one of the mysteries of the human condition. Now, I'm talking about genocide not simply as a historical perspective, of course. We're talking about this topic now because of the accusations that Israel is committing genocide in the Gaza Strip. South Africa is suing Israel at the International Court of Justice for being in violation of the Convention on Genocide, which both countries are signatories to. Now, there's a particular challenge to the Jewish state being accused of genocide. There's even a passage in the Israeli Declaration of Independence that draws on the recent experience of the Holocaust, when that statement was issued in 1948, as justification for declaring a Jewish state. So is accusing Israel of genocide simply extra offensive? Is it trying to claim Israel is hypocritical and therefore not worthy of existence or of any kind of respect? Is this a case of Israel fighting for survival against a Hamas enemy that wants to destroy it? Or is what's happening in Gaza the wanton destruction of civilian lives and infrastructure necessary to life? Is it, in fact, an act of ethnic cleansing? That terrible euphemism. And is ethnic cleansing or expelling a people the same as genocide? Well, to grapple with that question, we have to look at the legal definition of genocide, what's being argued in the International Court of Justice. And so I'm going to pull up for you the key part of that convention. So here we have the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. It was one of the first conventions on human rights that the United Nations established after it was founded. And it was largely based on the work that Lemkin had done as a lawyer and advocate to deal with this issue. So it says here that a genocide is any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Again, notice that line, with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And here are the actions. 1, or A, I should say, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Again, with intent to destroy. That intent is in the overview. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, driving them into the desert, as with the Armenians, causing them starvation, as in the ghettos, and so on. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. So, again, preventing new generations from starting. Or, letter E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So these are these 5 actions that are listed in the Genocide Convention that, if they are done with an intent to destroy, again, any of those acts, doesn't have to be all of them, that nation or political entity is guilty of the crime of genocide. So if we looked at an example that's sometimes presented as a genocide, the case of Native Americans in the United States, or the relationship of Europeans and the United States to Native Americans in this continent. So did the, we'll call it the American government, commit genocide on Native Americans? Well, did they have an intent to destroy them in whole or in part? At times and places, absolutely. In California, for example, there was an absolutely genocidal initiative trying to wipe out the Native Americans in California between the middle of the 19th and the end of the 19th century. I just went recently, actually, to the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., and there's a whole section, a display on what California did to eliminate the Native Americans in California. And it included many of these steps with an explicit intent stated by the governor to destroy them. But you don't have to go any farther than the old saying, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, right? Now, what kind of actions did the United States take? Did they kill members of the group? Absolutely, including women, including children, right? It was not simply a battle of fixed armies. Did they cause serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group? Absolutely, with all the broken treaties, with the exploitative Indian agents in charge of relating from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to the Native American populations, the provision of alcohol and drug addiction even today, and so on. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. Do you know what happened to the American buffalo? It was killed in order to drive the Plains Indians off the plains. It was a starvation technique to take away their livelihood. There were bounties paid on buffalo hides, and the meat was left to rot. And so those huge herds of thousands, millions of buffalo that covered the landscape were wiped out by Americans being paid by the American government in order to change the conditions of life for the Native Americans on the plains. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Well, certainly the kind of austerity and extreme conditions they were subjected to would have a negative impact on fertility, although it wasn't a case of forced sterilization or anything like that, given the technology. And finally, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. We know about these Indian schools that were designed to Americanize the children and get them off the reservation. If not forcibly taking them for adoption, it was certainly forcibly removing their culture from them, including cutting their hair, forbidding them from speaking their language, and teaching them only American culture and English language. So based on these criteria, it's hard to argue that Americans did not commit genocide against Native Americans in many ways. Now, does that mean every American president had an intent to destroy this group? Not necessarily. As an overall impact on the population, however, I think it's pretty clear. So what about another case? And we'll talk more about this case next time when we talk about the rules of war as they apply to the Gaza conflict. What about the case of massive civilian casualties during World War II? Think about the bombing of Tokyo in March of 1945. Over 100,000 civilians were killed in Tokyo. Something like 10,000 acres were destroyed. In fact, if you look at the images from Gaza as Israel has pulled out, what's been left behind reminds me of World War II era cities and how destroyed they were. So how would that apply? You know, an incident of a war where you are bombing civilian populations. Well, is that an intent to destroy that religious or ethnic or national group? Well, I don't think that the Americans had a genocidal intention to wipe out all Japanese or even wipe out, well, they wanted to kill a lot of them, but not to wipe out a group in the same kind of, you know, entire identity destruction. And certainly that's not the case for the Allies in Germany. They were trying to kill German workers, but not to destroy the German people. They did kill members of the group, so letter A is certainly met. They certainly caused bodily and mental harm to members of the group. The goal was to create a firestorm in Tokyo. Did they deliberately inflict upon the group conditions of life to bring about their destruction? They were hoping to break their spirits and their fighting spirits, which never happened. But it certainly was a terrible experience. Preventing births, transferring children, that wouldn't apply in this case. So would a mass bombing of killing 100,000 people in Tokyo in March of 1945 have qualified for genocide? Well, it's a tragedy. It's mass death. It might even be a war crime, as we'll talk about next time, based on what the military benefit that came out of it was compared to the civilian casualties that were incurred. Nevertheless, I don't think it's fair to call something like that a genocide based on the letter of the law, as we see it presented in this convention. So now, with that in mind, we can talk about the Gaza situation, comparing it to these criteria. Is there an Israeli intent to destroy the Palestinians as a whole or the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip? That would be the part, right? Well, they certainly have killed members of the group. They've certainly caused bodily and mental harm to members of the group. Now, are the conditions of life designed to bring about their physical destruction? This has been up for debate. It is certainly the case that some members of the Israeli government have made statements that can lend themselves to genocidal interpretation. Things like, there are no innocent people in Gaza. No food and no fuel will get into Gaza until the hostages are released. Other examples like that. Some people have even tried doing nonviolent protests to prevent food trucks from leaving Israel and going into Gaza. Some of them were surviving members of the hostage families whose family members are being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. Others were members of right-wing coalition parties that are simply more belligerent in this conflict and want nothing to go into support Palestinian life there, and who are in favor, in fact, of reestablishing Jewish settlements in Gaza. This has been stated by government ministers at large public events. Are there measures being imposed to prevent births within the Palestinian population? Nothing directly, of course, although malnutrition and lack of medical care can certainly lead to that result. And there's no stealing of children from one group to another. In this case, that's not relevant. But the key question is there this intent to destroy? And how is that determined? Is it a government decision that's stated publicly? Unlikely. Is it to be derived from actions that the government has taken? Well, if you look at what's been happening in the West Bank, it's been very problematic, but it's not been genocidal there. And even in Gaza proper, over the last week, Israel has let in, even the last few days, has let in something like 1,200 trucks compared to the average of 150 a day over the previous month in March. So they certainly are open to food going in. Now, is that having stopped the genocide that they were trying to commit by keeping starvation food in circulation in Gaza? Is it the fault of Hamas, which by many reports has taken over these trucks and has kept the food for their soldiers? I heard one commentator, Riley, note that Israel has yet to capture a starving Hamas fighter. So however much food is getting in there, Hamas fighters are eating reasonably well. Whether the general population is getting that is a different question. So, the conditions of life question is a function of what Israel has allowed in, what Hamas has done with what has been allowed in, whether what's been allowed in has been able to get to the people who really need it the most. And ultimately, the question of Israel's intent can be deduced in the negative. I've said this in past examples of conflicts in Gaza. If Israel wanted there to be 300,000 dead, with all of their firepower and all of their military might, there would be 300,000 dead. The fact that there are 32,000 dead, as tragic as that is for every person and every family affected by that, it shows that there isn't an intent to wipe out the population physically. However, remember that genocide is not just a function of killing mass numbers. It's a function of identity, morale, even presence in that location. That expulsion maybe can be part of a genocide because it is part of the intent to destroy the identity, causing seriously mental harm, and inflicting a condition of life. If your identity is based on where you are and you're expelled from that place, then that can attack your sense of who you are and your communal cohesiveness. So if the people in Gaza were expelled into Egypt, if Israel reestablished settlements in Gaza proper, would that count as a genocide, as an ethnic cleansing to the point of meriting the charge? And finally, does undermining a national identity itself count as a kind of cultural genocide? After all, Israel has certainly not supported the Palestinian Authority. They've been chipping away at what possible territory could become a Palestinian state in the West Bank. They have cracked down on Palestinian national expressions, even among their own permanent residents in East Jerusalem. And so it could be that Israel's fighting against the Palestinian national identity could be construed as a kind of genocide. But the last thing we have to realize, and then I want to open it up for discussion, is that the very accusation of genocide is serving a political purpose. It's not academics who are rationally and dispassionately evaluating whether Israel has or has not met these criteria for committing a genocide. This is a political maneuver. This is a way of attacking Israel's attempts to defend itself, to fight against Hamas, to try to release the hostages, and how it's conducting the war, which we can debate and we will talk about next week. It's also an attempt to undermine support for those who support Israel. Think about people referring to Genocide Joe, referring to Joe Biden and his support for Israel, including military aid, as well as diplomatic cover and negotiation support. It's a way of furthering the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which has tried to isolate Israel even long before October 7th. And it's a way of distracting attention, because this conflict began, at least this round of the conflict began, on October 7th with an invasion of Israel proper from Gaza by Hamas that killed 1,200 people, something like 250 soldiers and another 900 civilians, and killed them in brutal ways with rape and torture, and kidnapped another 250 hostages to take back into Gaza with them. That's also part of the context of this. And Hamas said, they've said it publicly, if they could do 5 more October 7th, they would do it. And they would keep doing it until there wasn't in Israel and there weren't Israelis there anymore. So we've seen in recent political history the power of it's not me, it's you. That when someone's accused of a crime, they turn it around and accuse the other person of the same crime. You think I'm corrupt? No, he's corrupt. You think I'm a puppet? They're a puppet. You think we're genocidal, says Hamas? No, Israel's genocide. It may be that the International Court of Justice will make a decision and try to enforce some kind of a ceasefire. They may manage to delay and delay and delay a decision until after a ceasefire is already the case. And then they can say, oh, yes, we want a ceasefire. And then it will be effective because it's already true. But the battle over whether Gaza is or is not a genocide is not only an academic, factual case. You see, it's a political one. It's an emotional one. It's a tribal allegiance one. Depending on which tribe you belong to, you may be more or less sympathetic to the accusation that what's happening in Gaza is indeed some kind of genocide. And so with that, I'm going to take my spotlight off, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts on either the history of the development of the term of genocide, some of the criteria that were described by Lemkin or by the UN Convention, or your thoughts on the situation in Gaza as it's developed over the last 6 months. Yeah, Mark.
I'll go first. I agree with virtually everything you said, Adam. The interpretation, the kind of nuanced interpretation of these different events. But my only objection would be to take what you said at the very end and flip it, because the argument, the part of the argument about considering Hamas's role in this needs to be put at the top of the list. When the preamble to the bullet points lists intent to destroy a people. I think it's very clear that Israel's intent in Gaza this time around is to destroy Hamas based on Hamas's attack on Israel. Israel did not, and Israel has stated that. And the enemy they're fighting, Hamas, has stated their intention to wipe out Israel and Israelis and Jews. Israel has never stated that they intend to wipe out Palestinians. They've never stated that they are at war with Palestinians who live in Gaza. They are at war with Hamas. So there is definitely, there's murkiness and the fog of war and debate about, is Israel going too far in the damage they're inflicting against Palestinians living in Gaza in their pursuit of Hamas. But Hamas's physical and political position in this conflict is undeniably at the top of that list about intent. I think it would be very difficult to make an argument that Israel is intending to commit genocide against Palestinians, wipe out the Palestinian culture and people and history and religion. But they are intending to defeat entirely this military and political opponent who struck first.
Well, part of the argument is that by resisting a two-state solution, they are trying to prevent a Palestinian state and a Palestinian national identity. So that, the genocide it's a moving bar, right? They're from killing everybody to not allowing us to become a state is a very different category of action, but it sometimes is treated as comparable. Yes, William had his hand up. And then I agree 200, I assume that's 200%.
Yeah.
William.
Yeah, I mean, I guess honestly, well, thank you for this. I guess sometimes I kind of struggle with this, but I guess I'm thinking now it's more, Israel's not attempting to do genocide, but the IDF seems to have a reckless disregard for civilian lives in their operation. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, this I'll be talking more about next week when I talk about the rules of war as it's been reflected in the Gaza conflict. But the question about the regard for civilian life and how much regard is being manifested in certain behaviors. I mean, if you have the situation where the Israeli army shot their own hostages who were escaping because they were sort of in a free fire zone where anything that moves was able to be shot at. The fact that the World Central Kitchen trucks were bombed. I mean, these are unfortunately data some people will read. Mark, you're right. They didn't say explicitly, this is our agenda to wipe them out, but people will say, well, if they're wiping out the food, if they're attacking food convoys and they're causing riots and they're, when there was a attempt for people to get to the food and then they shot at the people who were coming close to them. And then it's sort of, they claim to be deducing a genocidal intent or again, creating the conditions of life that lead to that kind of a result. And so the treatment of civilians and how much aid is going in and so on is used as evidence to deduce a genocide, even if you don't have the explicit, red flag, we're going to kill them all kind of statement, which you don't always have in past history of genocidal actions. And so, William, to answer your question directly, Israel would say that a 2-to-1 ratio of civilian to combatant deaths, which is how Israel has calculated the numbers, that about, if it's 32,000 dead, then about 8,000 were militants fighting and the balance were civilians. They would argue that for in urban setting combat, a 2-to-1 civilian to militant ratio is actually pretty good historically compared to past, fighting in urban settings. Maybe the bar has shifted since the 1940s when you had, urban settings, the Warsaw Ghetto fighting, that kind of thing. That's going to be an ethical debate over how many civilian deaths are too many, what the right proportion should be, what's justified or not. Do you allow, what do you do if accidents happen? Which, I mean, look, friendly fire costs 10% of most armies, where their own artillery kills their own soldiers, and those are accidents. But and so that if you have civilians into the mix, it's going to happen too. But how many accidents becomes not an accident anymore? That's a subjective evaluation. Sorry, Broen, you've had your hand up.
I've been curious for a while because I hear, in news of Netanyahu, PM Netanyahu saying that a Palestinian state would be an unacceptable threat. What is his idea? And instead of that, is it this forever? And just how that relates to the sort of preventing nation clauses.
Right. Well, one of the major critiques of Netanyahu, even within Israel, and sometimes even with people on his side of the political spectrum, is that he's reactive but not visionary. He doesn't have a long-term vision. His approach to Gaza was bottle it up and keep it in the bottle. And if Qatar will send them money and keep them in the bottle, then we'll keep them in the bottle. And he felt he could keep them in the bottle forever. And meanwhile, he could keep the Palestinian Authority separated from Hamas, so they couldn't form a joint government and thus provide a united front to push for a united Palestinian state. And that would enable him to do what he wanted to in the West Bank and establish more settlements and keep his coalitions, and most importantly, keep himself in government to keep himself out of jail. So he's been focused so much on the short-term tactical that he doesn't really have the long-term strategic vision. I mean, decades ago, he said he was open to some kind of a demilitarized Palestinian state. But he was forced to say that. He didn't want to say that. He said it reluctantly, and he's never followed through on any positive steps that could be recognized. Now, his perspective on this is not without evidence. It's informed by what happened in Gaza in 2006 and what happened in Lebanon in the year 2000. In Lebanon, there had been an Israeli security presence in the southern, say, 10 miles of Lebanon, with a proxy army called the Southern Lebanese Army and Israeli soldiers there. And they were dying, by Hezbollah militant actions at, hundreds a year sometimes. Ehud Barak who was the prime minister then, said, we're going to pull out of Lebanon. And they pulled back to the internationally recognized border. The UN even said Israel has moved to the international border. Hezbollah rushed in, set up their rockets, dug their bunkers, and there was a war between Israel and Lebanon in the early 2000s because of rocket fire coming in from Lebanon. So the lesson that some people learned from that was you pull out, the other side pulls in and is that much closer to bombing our cities. What happened in Gaza in 2006? Israel pulled out. The PA tried to take over. Ultimately, Hamas took over and literally executed members of the PA authority that were there, threw them off of buildings and other murders. And within a few years, by 2008, we had rockets coming from Gaza and Israel attacking Gaza back. So the argument that Netanyahu makes when he says that the Palestinian Authority is, as an independent state would be an unacceptable security risk is based on what happened in Lebanon and what happened in Gaza, that when you pull back, they shoot rockets. Now, if there were prospects for some other kind of peace, if there were inducements to compromise, if there were gestures of goodwill on the Israeli side, if there were not provocations in various forms, including settlement expansion in the West Bank, we could be having a very different conversation here. But in Israel, unfortunately, in the aftermath of the Second Intifada, the peace camp has very little credibility. You look at the Labor Party, which was the flagship party of the country. On every poll, they're polling at 0 seats right now if there were an election held today. With all of Netanyahu's unpopularity, nobody wants the Labor Party anymore. And they're not in the Knesset currently. And the Meretz Party, which is the other far-left, pro-peace party, is polling at the bare minimum of 4 seats, as they have 4 seats, I believe, now. So the Israeli left has really fallen apart. The center is larger, but the center is dubious of what kind of partners for peace the Palestinians would be, certainly given the aftermath of what's happened in Gaza. Now, Hamas is not popular in Gaza now either, because the people on the street, from what opinion polls can be garnered and what interviews can be done, know that Hamas brought this on them. They also know that Israel is causing it. The Israeli slogan of "we had to destroy the village in order to save it" is not a particularly persuasive argument for the Palestinian population. The aid trucks will be better. Fostering a substitute or a replacement government for Hamas would be better. But that requires strategic thinking. That requires imagining a long-term prospect of coexistence. And Netanyahu is living in the short term of, how can I stay in power? How can I not lose power? And if that requires long-term strategic concessions, I can't make those big picture decisions. He's having another crisis right now over the conscription of Orthodox yeshiva students, because the Supreme Court and the Attorney General have finally said enough is enough. They have to serve, whether it's a national service or special units just for them so they don't have to see women in pants. Whatever we have to do, they need to do their duty like other soldiers do, like other citizens do. But because of coalition considerations, Netanyahu has pushed it down the road and kicked the can down the road. And he can't solve it for the good of the country. The vast majority of the non-Orthodox country wants some kind of national service from the Orthodox male population. And Netanyahu has been dodging it to the detriment of the country. So there are plenty of Israelis who are just as done with Netanyahu as Joe Biden is. But because of the way the coalition government works, until it's 5 members of his coalition that decide to leave, we're stuck with him until, I think, 2026. Any other thoughts? Mark, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think we've moved a little bit afield from genocide.
Fair enough.
I also wanted to just kind of loop back on something that maybe just highlight something that you said about the politics of this and the intentional use of the term genocide, which, just talking about this semantic political strategy in itself is another argument against the entire idea that Israel is committing a genocide. The term is being used very intentionally as part of this anti-Semitic propaganda strategy that we should all be very familiar with, and we should all be very sensitive to and aware of. And the fact that it is filtered into our own media, and that when we hear members of Congress or the UN or the International Court using this term against Israel, we have to have our filters active, and we have to understand how intentional that is, and the kind of trying to step back and apply simple logic. And we've talked about this before. Would Israel have anything to gain by truly attempting to commit genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, etc.? On the other hand, we have an opponent that has explicitly stated their intent to commit genocide against Israel. So when this term is turned back on the Israelis, back on the Jews, back on the people who suffered through the most cataclysmic genocide of the last century, we have to be kind of vigilant in our critical thinking skills and being aware of why it's being used and how that is really an argument against whether Israel is actually committing this crime.
I generally agree with you. However, I don't think that the fact that the Jews endured a Holocaust makes them immune to committing other crimes, right?
No, not immune, but particularly vulnerable to this false accusation.
Okay, so or sensitive to it and reacting in very negative ways to that accusation. But they were denied national rights by the British for a long time, right? And now they're denying that same national right that they claim for themselves to another people. So the accusation of hypocrisy has to be evaluated based on behavior. In the case of genocide, again, as I think I've made clear, I don't think it's justified in this respect. But I just am leery of trying to use the Holocaust as the get out of jail free card. We can't commit war crimes because we had the ultimate war crime done. Well, that's not true. Oppressed minorities can oppress other minorities. It's not a case of immune from critique. Susie, were you going to jump in?
No, I'm trying to figure out what to say about this. It's so appalling. We can apply. Let me think on my feet a little bit. We can apply the criteria that have been established to define genocide, and it's for a particular intent. And we can perhaps say, well, Israel isn't doing it for this purpose. Israel is doing 3 out of these 5 things, and they're having this heinous effect. And it might not be the intent, but there's a certain callousness to the collateral damage that ultimately begs the question, do we need to call it a genocide? And yes, there's the propaganda and there's the political. You were very, very, very clear and very helpful about defining the political aspects of the label. And yet all this completely begs the question that terrible, terrible things are happening. And to think that it's going to be solved on the battlefield is very inappropriate. So yes, it's worth talking about and having a certain amount of awareness. On the other hand, the solutions have to be addressed probably in other terms. Maybe that's what I want to say.
I said, I can't remember whether it was the month after or a few months after the conflict began, imagine what would happen if Israel's slogan was, we're going into Gaza to save 2 million hostages. It's it's our people, but also the Palestinians who are being held captive by Hamas. And we're going to surge food just like we're attacking infrastructure, and we're going to have a legitimate plan for the refugees. We'll try to maintain their safety as much as possible. And it would have had a very different message, because it couldn't be a genocide if you're sending them food, out their ears. It's just harder to make that case. Now, the expulsion, the idea that you're creating conditions unfit for life, that it's like with Carthage, you're sowing the fields with salt so nothing will ever grow there again. Well, now you're just sowing it with, tank shrapnel and unexploded munitions and who knows what. I mean, the cleanup in Gaza is going to take so long and be so expensive, and the rebuilding, I mean, you could make a paradise, but it's also going to be a hell for quite a while. And was that an effect by Hamas hiding in the civilian territory? Absolutely. And who was the bulldozer? It was Israel. So that's the impossible cell of image versus fact, of ultimate responsibility or legal responsibility versus attributed responsibility. If the terrorist hides behind a child and you shoot the terrorist but kill the child, who's to blame? Either both or mostly one, but a little bit the other. This is the terrible logic of terrorism, but the child is still dead.
That you have a dead child. That's the point. I think your point that if Israel had positioned itself as an advocate for the Palestinians who are ultimately hostage of Hamas, that is such a different message, and it might have had enough of an impact to change this whole discussion and to change the whole situation. But you've got Netanyahu and his government, and their priorities are very different from really getting to solutions. As you say, he's trying to keep power, he's trying to stay out of the legal system, and he doesn't care who suffers or is sacrificed.
I will also say, though, that having received genocidal violence on October 7th, the Israeli public was not so inclined to think about the well-being of the Palestinians either. It was, as people have said, it was the worst day for Jewish death since the Holocaust, to have that many die at once in that brutal way. And so they weren't necessarily in a position to feel that sympathetic. Just like Americans in World War II were not upset at 100,000 Japanese dying in the Tokyo firebomb. I'll bet they weren't. I bet very few Americans outside of the Japanese American population were broken up over that casualty list. Now, maybe to our credit, we have more sensitivity and more awareness of the humanity of our enemies these days. And so we're less willing to tolerate 25,000 dead in Dresden or 100,000 dead in Tokyo like we might have 2 generations ago. And so any mass death becomes a genocide. But ultimately, for us, drawing the line between a tragedy and a genocide, not every tragedy is a genocide. And that's part of what this issue is all about. Mark? Look, it's a tough world out there, and people do terrible things. You can look at the helpers, but we also have to sometimes look into the dark corners of our own souls and realize that, as in the words of one Israeli poet, they too were human beings. And so are we. So if our inner chimpanzee comes out and kills the other because they are the other, we know that as well as being generous and altruistic and kind, that too is human.